Hey there guys, today we're going to be forging a Viking Age style skillet, so here's some images flashing on your screen of some examples. Now these were found all over and in all kinds of different places like high status warrior graves, ship burials like the Oseberg example here. So these are very common items. And I'm not basing mine off any one particular example, I'm just kind of taking some average measurements from what was common throughout the era, and taking little motifs that I liked from different examples and kind of just mishmashing it all together. So I'm starting with some flat bar here that is, I think it's about 1.25 inches wide. This is old footage, but I think it was about 1.25 inches wide, and it's fairly thin, as you can see there. Only a few millimeters thick. Not sure the exact dimensions. It's not important again since I'm not making an exact replica here. But it's really hard to work, and that was the theme of making this. This will become the handle section. So I'm forming a taper on the end, and it's constantly trying to roll over on itself or fold together rather than upset and forge down into a taper. So you see I have to keep taking it back to the flat and straightening everything else so I don't get cold shuts. Eventually, we do get a taper though, so putting in the hot cut plate so that way I can cut into this, because this will become the ram's horn motif that is kind of common on this style of pan, especially modern reproductions of them. You can also see it in the Oseberg example I pictured earlier. So just making sure everything's straight, and then I'm going to use the last dull bit of heat to mark where I'm going to make my cut. It's easier to make a mark with this dull heat than trying to do it when it's red hot or bright iridescent, because you can see the metal much more clearly, line everything up well, and you can still get a deep enough mark that when you put it back in the fire you'll be able to feel it when you take it out. So you can see I didn't do a good job keeping things in focus, but you can just barely make out the line there that I cut into the metal. And once I take that back out of the fire, I'll be able to index my chisel right into that without having to worry about lining things up. So now hitting quite hard to cut through the metal. I decided to go about 1.5 times the width of my chisel there. So I think that's about maybe 1.75 inches, roughly, if you wanted to try to replicate this yourself. And this will form the two ram's horns that will be scrolled up here in a minute. It's easier to do it this way than to split the metal first and then try to draw out two even tapers. But we do have to clean it up a little bit, so I take it over to the vise. I'm going to hammer straight down into the joint there where the two tapers meet, just to clean that up. This actually took a few heats because, as I said earlier, this material is so thin it's a pain in the butt, so it just wants to bend and do things you don't want it to do. But once I got that cleaned up, now it's time to actually bend it intentionally, because I need to clean up all the rag and the sharp edge that was formed by chisel cutting. So I just filed that off camera after bending them out like so. And then I've broken out my tiny hammer here. This was one of the first times I actually got to use this hammer. Like I said, this footage is really old. It was actually filmed around the same time I made the anvil. So this hammer was fairly new to me at the time, and I was kind of looking for excuses to use it and play with it. So it might not have been the most optimal here, but that's what I chose. And you can see I'm forming the ram's horns now by scrolling this up. Oh, now I wasn't super happy with how this scroll was forming, so I did break out the round punch just to kind of drift it back out to round it up. And this actually took really well. Just the single heat of doing this opened it right up, and it looked nice and round, and I was much happier with how it looked. So now I just had to finish the bottom half of that scroll, get everything in line and straight and looking good, and then it was time to move on to the other one. I'll speed this up quite quick. I know some people really like to see every single hammer blow, but I want to speed this up. One thing of note, though, is as I straightened this out, I got a little bit of inspiration looking at that form there, as you see. It reminded me of some of the pendants people make for Jormungandr. It's kind of that same exact shape. So, it's kind of cool seeing it scaled up, so that inspired me a little bit to maybe make some larger projects with that same shape to it. And it's always important to take a look at your work as you're going, because you never know when you'll see inspiration like that, so it's good to kind of examine it every now and then, just see what cool shapes might be coming of it. You can see I'm getting playful with the hammer as I'm waiting for it to heat up. But we eventually get both ram's horns finished, so now it is time to start working on the rest of the handle. So starting by, I'm going to isolate the material where I just made the ram's horn finial end. So I'm using my guillotine tool here. You could just use a spring fuller. If you don't have a spring fuller, you could just use the edge of the anvil, line it up with the edge of your hammer, and with some precise hammer strikes you can accomplish the exact same thing. This just makes it a little bit easier since I work alone. Having extra tools helps when you don't have a striker. And these are fairly cheap and easy to build. It's just two radiused piece of metals called dies, and you see they're exactly the same, so it pinches the metal between them. Now I do rotate the metal between heats and after every so many hits, just to kind of eliminate the human error, because if I don't hold it perfectly parallel or whatever, then those fullers will be off-center, and we don't want that. So now that that's formed, I can knock off the corners of that transition and start tapering it back into the handle. And this took quite a lot of work, quite a lot of heats, so I won't actually show every single hammer blow. See here, I start speeding it up quite a lot. Realized it was starting to get ridiculous, so we're just gonna jump cut here in a second to further along in the process of drawing out this nice, long, elegant taper. And there we go. So you can see now I've got quite a bit of the material tapered out. It's looking much more handle shape. Now, in reality, you could just start with some smaller material, not make as fancy a finial end, especially since it's on the underside of the skillet. And then you wouldn't have to do this as much, and you wouldn't have to fiddle with the annoying to work with material. But, alas, I chose to do it this way, so now I'm trying to get everything straight, so that way I can measure it. So I'm going to draw it out just a little bit more. Clean up that transition at the end. Then again, I have to straighten it back out, but you can see I'm measuring there, and this is where I make a critical mistake. So you see I measured from the shoulder of the ram's head down the length of the handle, and I was cutting it off at 11 inches. And this was roughly the average that was listed for this style of pan from this period. But I didn't realize where they were measuring from, and that was a critical mistake because I measured from totally the wrong place. You see, that ram's head is going to be under the center, or at least it was intended to be under the center of the pan, the round disc of metal that will become the pan. So the round disc of metal is going to be 8 inches in diameter. So that means it's going to cover 4 inches of that handle. So I'm only going to have a few extra inches sticking out. So it'd be quite a short handle, and it wouldn't be anywhere near the length that it was supposed to be in my head, or compared to most examples I've seen that have intact handles. So that was a mistake. If you're going to make one of these yourself, make sure that you include the radius of whatever the material you're using for the pan itself when you make your handle measurement. Consider how they're going to overlap. So here you can see I'm isolating some more material. This is to make the end of the handle. So I'm going to put a hook on the end, similar again to like the Oseberg style. This is just a really handy thing, so that way you can let your pan dry over the fire, so that way it doesn't rust or hang it up when you're not using it or whatever. So just isolate that material and then forge it down, start tapering it. Once it gets started with the taper, it's not as bad to work with. Going over to the horn here to kind of clean up that transition, make it nice and smooth and a little bit more gradual. Blending it all together very nicely. Realizing it's still a little thick, so I can draw it out just a little bit more. Now here I swap back to this little hammer. This was actually because I was starting to feel a little fatigued, but I think this was kind of a mistake because I feel like it just fatigued me more because I was having to hit 2 and 3 times as many times, but I kind of realized that, so I went to a in-between hammer. So this hammer is about 1.5 pounds, I think, or close to 2 pounds. So it's less than my 2.5 pound, but more than the 1 pound hammer. And for this light work, it was good enough. Now I'm going to scroll the end, so I'm forging it down away from that inside transition we just made. So towards the outside of the handle. Just putting a little curly Q on the end. Making it nice and pretty. And then we'll heat up the bar again. And now I'm going to forge down that tail that we just formed. Forge it down to about 45 degrees, and then we can start rolling it over the edge of the anvil and forming the hook that will let this hang from a nail or a hook or whatever. Now, quick and easy way of forming that hook is to just take it over to a jig. Of course, you can do this over the anvil. You can do it with an anvil with no horn. You can do it however you like, but I decided since this material was already fiddly enough and I was getting tired of hammering, as I said, I decided to just take it over to the jig and clean it up that way, and it worked splendidly. You can make a jig like this fairly easily if you want, without welding. You just have to get a bar of metal that is the radius you want, and then just bend it into a U, and leave a gap appropriate for the material you commonly work with. And that'll work just fine. So now, not having yet realized my mistake, I am now going to punch the hole for the rivet that will hold the skillet pan to the handle. So, pretty simple. Just going to punch a round hole right through the center there. Now, you could probably do this cold with a good punch. I don't have a good punch. I just have a cheap thing I got at a hardware store I need to replace and make my own. So, struggling here just a little bit with the material cooling constantly. Makes it a little bit harder to punch through. So this took a few extra heats than thicker material might have taken. But with this heat here, I was finally able to punch most of the way through and leave a nice dark mark, which you can see on the opposite side. So when I flip it over, you can see that little dot. That's exactly where the hole is, because that area is slightly colder than the rest of the material. So I can line up the punch with that, punch right dead center of it, and slowly punch out this slug. Now the slug actually got stuck because of the material cooled so quickly. So you can see it started warping the material a bit too much to my liking. So I just flipped it right back over, hammered it flat, grabbed the punch, and punched it out from the original direction we started. And the punch finally did knock the slug out. Of course, then I have to struggle to get the punch back out because everything's cooled off and shrunk around it. But with enough fiddling and knocking everything on the floor, we get it out. Now just to flatten and clean everything up, make sure everything's true and in line, clean it up with the brush. And right there I realized my mistake, so I took it over to my template I drew out for the pan, realized I had made a critical mistake, and so now I'm back to drawing out this taper to try to get as much length as I can out of this handle, because, like I said earlier, I realized I did not measure from the right point, so I should have considered the radius of the pan that would be sitting in there. So if you're making an 8-inch pan like me, add 4 inches to whatever piece of material you are working with, and that will give you the proper length that you need. If you're working with a larger pan or a smaller pan, just adjust accordingly. Like I said, it's the radius you're looking for. But now I'm just making sure everything's nice and straight. In line, looking good. And then I'm going to take it to the vise and use the wire brush to knock off all the scale that I can. Now, historically, Vikings didn't have angle grinders with wire brushes, or probably any kind of wire brush, so they would have just planished this, but this is what I did, so I'm showing you what I did. Now we move on to making the actual skillet pan itself. So I've got some mild steel, 16 gauge, and I'm cutting it out with the angle grinder. But of course, as soon as I get cutting, my battery dies, so decided that was time for lunch. So went got lunch, charged it. Now it's cutting much more aggressively, much better there. So I can cut out this shape. I started by just cutting a square, and then I realized that wouldn't be very efficient, so I'll make a couple smaller cuts here. Then just break it off. Then I take it over to the grinder to just remove the excess material. Now, looking back, this is quite wasteful, and there's a lot of better ways I could have done this. I think if I were going to make another pan like this today, I would cold chisel this, so just get a nice, good, sharp, cold chisel and just chisel it out. That'd be more accurate to how it might have been done in period. It would have been much easier, probably a lot quicker, and just a lot more enjoyable as well. Not sitting at a grinder with a mask on and sparks going everywhere and noise. Just could sit right at the anvil and just chisel it out. Now here was my fix for the length of the handle. I ended up moving the nail from the center point over to be off-center there. So it's still lined up with the center in one axis, but in another axis I've moved it down. Now, historically, Vikings and craftsmen would have used whatever they had on hand, and I've seen some really scrappy pans. Here's an example of one that is basically just scrap metal riveted together into something that could almost be called a pan. So I'm certain that the Vikings or whoever else during this period would not have scrapped a project just because they made the handle the wrong size. They would have done something like this to fix it and just lived with it. Because as long as it does the job, that's all that really matters, right? So now I've drilled that hole, and I'm going to drift it out with a square drift. So you saw me heat it up with the blowtorch there. And I'm using the square drift because I've set this hole off-center. If this were to start rotating, it would obviously go all wonky and just would look terrible. So we don't want that, so I'm going to try my best to ensure this will never rotate by punching a square hole, so when I rivet this together, it will not be able to rotate at all around that rivet. And that's a simple enough process, just heating it up with my little blowtorch. I do need a better torch eventually, but for now, this one's doing the job. It's just a little cheap hardware store torch with some map gas, which burns just a little bit hotter in theory than propane. But eventually I'll get myself an oxyacetylene or oxypropane set up and heat this up in seconds rather than having to sit here and wait so long. But just to give you a sense of how long it does take to heat up. It doesn't take too long because it is so thin, but long enough. Really, you could almost do this cold, but you'd risk cracking it or tearing it, so I'm almost more annealing it here than I am forging it, because by the time I get the punch back in it, it'll be cold again, as you'll see. But even so, annealing it still helps soften it enough that I can get it in there. Of course, I have to find the pritcher hole, but once I do, I can ram it in there good and far, get that hole drifted out. Now with that done, now it's time to figure out how to shape the pan. And you see, I start thinking about different parts of the anvil, and I trying to figure out which one would work best. I think maybe the side shelf, maybe the tail. Couldn't quite make up my mind at first, so ended up deciding what would be best would be to start with a ball peen hammer and just work over the hardy hole. So this is a simple way, if you don't have any kind of stump or anything like that to dish material, you can just use the hardy hole. Of course, if you have a big pritcher hole, you can use that and it would maybe leave a few less sharp marks. But if your anvil's like mine and been dressed fairly well, then in theory it shouldn't be leaving marks even over the hardy hole like this. So I'm doing my best to try to stay consistent with my hammering. You see I go off here a little bit. It's not too big a deal though, we'll correct that in just a minute. We're in the very early stages of developing the form here. I just want to roll a lip over a bit and give this just the ever so slightest amount of dishing. Again, this is kind of more of a skillet. You know, pretty much just a flat sheet of metal, but the lip helps a lot, obviously, with not dropping your food into the campfire. See here, I'm using the side shelf a little bit. Then I finally realized I could come over to the tail of the anvil and use that to kind of clean up that corner with the flat face of this ball peen. This ball peen's fairly flat on the front. It's not overly radiused like my other hammers, so it's a nice kind of almost planishing hammer kind of technique here where I can just take it over to this thin little bit and just hammer right where I need to hammer. And that kind of sharpened up that transition between the lip and the flat bottom of the pan there a little bit. Also helps me work out any kinks or waves that are forming in it. And really, this is the start of what is a very long process that you can take as long as you want of just rolling that edge and then taking it back to the flat of the anvil and flattening it out, rolling the edge, smoothing it out, back and forth, basically until you're happy with it. Now, if you have a wooden stump or something like that, then this could go probably a lot easier, I think. At this time, I actually didn't have a good stump to use. Now I'm borrowing one from a friend, so in future projects I'll be able to use that. But back then I didn't, so I did try this. This is a kind of like an armor stake that I bought on Amazon for $80, so it's super cheap for what it is. There's cheaper options. You could just use a kettlebell or a truck hitch or anything like that, or just a big ball bearing. But I'm trying this because I have it, and it smooths it out a little bit, I think. So the way you use this is you put the metal on it and you're kind of hitting where the metal isn't touching the stake itself. So you're kind of knocking it down onto that. And that seemed to help move things around a little bit faster, but you see here I'm taking it back to the anvil, kind of straightening everything out. Because I don't want it to curl and warp and, you know, wave in multiple directions. I want it to be mostly flat. Now I did switch over to the rounding hammer, thinking it was kind of like a gentler ball peen, and also the radius of the rounding face kind of, it's not quite a perfect match, but it matches the radius of that stake just a little bit, so helping me also knock out some of the hammer marks just a little bit. I didn't overly planish this. I didn't really care that much if there were a few hammer marks in it. Again, you look at some of the originals and they're basically scrap metal, so I don't think they cared either. And this one's for me, not for a customer, so I can afford a little bit of laziness. If I were making this for somebody, of course I'd try to get every hammer mark I could out of it. But any armorer will tell you that planishing is probably the worst step. So if you don't have to do it, then you can save a lot of wear and tear on your joints by not doing it. So I'm just kind of taking this to rough form and just getting the worst of the hammer marks out. Not worrying too much about it. So I didn't show forming the head of the rivet, but here you can see I'm filing it square, so that it'll fit in that square hole. I think I did also eventually drift the hole in the ram's head square as well, but again I didn't show that. But I'm just filing this so that way it'll be a nice tight fit. I want it to be as perfect a fit as I can. So once it's pretty close, I can just hammer it down, stretch that metal a little bit around it. And then it's a perfect fit. I'm just kind of eyeballing here where to cut it off, because I want a nice flush rivet. I don't want, you know, a big dome or something like that. So we don't want a whole lot of extra material. But it is a fairly thin rivet too, so starting this at the rivet header. Now I had heated this up a little bit, but by the time everything was reassembled, it was cold again. So after getting it kind of set in place and making sure everything was where I needed it to be, I just grabbed the blowtorch again. So again, it would be really handy if I had a oxyacetylene or something where I could get that to a glowing orange in mere seconds. But alas, we're here with the map gas, so doing my best. Straightening it out and just hammering it down. Then rolling it over to the ball peen side to peen it over a little bit. Again, deciding to anneal it. So I want this to be as flat as I can, so don't want it to crack and, you know, be too much of a mess. Eventually decided to forgo the little rivet setter, so I didn't want to leave too many marks in the ram's head. Once I get it nice and where I want it, I just give it a few taps on the anvil to make sure everything's straight, and then we're off to cleaning it up with the wire wheel and the angle grinder. Trying to get as much of the scale and grime and rust and all that bad stuff off of here. Now, this is a carbon steel pan, so it will need to be treated just like any kind of cast iron cookware. So here you can see I'm starting to season it, but I actually seasoned the bottom side with beeswax as well, just to help waterproof it a little bit extra. And that gives it a little bit more uniform finish. So I did linseed oil, then beeswax, and then kind of back and forth a little bit. And you can see I got a nice even finish on the back. I did that on the handle as well, and then I seasoned the pan, just the actual inside of the pan where the food would be, just like you would any cast iron, with some canola oil. And here's a photo with some other random little bits of kitchenware that are period appropriate that I have. And I took this camping with me at Ren Fair, and it served me very well. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one.